Shall we end here, or is there anything else?
No, I think that's great. I said, thank you, Mr. President.
Wow, what an interview. Woof, woof. And was it 2 hours? It felt like 2 hours. I think it was Joe Rogan actually that was on the X platform in Mario's space before we went live that said he'd spoken to Tucker and that it was 2 hours, it was unedited. I did find it a bit strange how, I don't know whether they'd not balanced it, they'd obviously been in a rush, but Tucker's voice was booming really loud. I sort of jumped off my seat a couple of times. And his humour's a bit weird. I mean, he was guffawing, that's a British word. He was laughing quite madly a couple of times, which I'm not sure whether Putin appreciated. And I think I picked up some Putin sarcasm, where he, or through the translator, obviously Tucker said a couple of things and they weren't particularly favourable, and Putin sort of said, "Oh, I'm glad you appreciated that." I'm not sure, but maybe there was some sarcasm. Now, I know a lot of people who are much more qualified and much more capable than me of interpreting that interview will be doing a little follow-up. So the only thing that I think I could maybe add a little bit of perception value to is having a look at it from an economic perspective, because there was an awful lot of economic data, and not just the data, but the analysis, or particularly Putin's perspective on the different economies and how they were faring against each other. So he was very, very favourable about China and my friend in China, my friend as the country, and then, China, the president, China, he was, well, a bit sycophantic, I thought. Anyway, so let's have a look. I've got my trusty notebook here, which I managed to badly scribble in. But you know what? My title for the beginning of this economic review of the Putin interview from Tucker Carlson, my title is going to be The Boogeyman Story, because the amount of times that Putin said boogeyman, in the context of don't believe everything you read, the boogeyman has got to it, which I thought was quite entertaining. So let's have a look at it, because from an economic perspective, I definitely got the impression Putin was not only knowledgeable about a lot of the economic cross-comparison of the different major economies, but he also had fingers at his fingers. He had data at his fingertips. Now, when I worked as an economist, that was what an economist was, good or bad. You were dictated whether you knew the figures. You needed to know the figures like this. You had to do unemployment, inflation, 3 or 4 different countries. If you didn't know the exact figure, you were no good. So the way that Putin was so confidently giving out figures on the American economy, the Chinese economy, I think he did that more than his own economy, actually. But let's have a quick look at some of them, because this is the sort of thing I was referring to. And he was talking with interesting adjectives, which obviously went through the translator, but I'm sure the translator was, fairly careful in the words that were used. And there were a couple of digs about the US debt. Because we got onto the dollar, and obviously that was a good question. Tucker had to ask that, about the likelihood of the dollar surviving in this sort of growing BRICS climate. And clearly we had to talk about tariffs. Now, Putin was obviously very condemning of tariffs and questioning the whole point of them, really, because I think what he was saying is they haven't really done a great deal other than build up, quite substantially Russia's business with China, but also Russia's business with Europe, which is interesting. Yeah. And he also used the word aggression a lot. Notice when he was talking about the US, his description of how the US treated everything, politics, economics, those things, he used the adjective aggression. And I like to look at the adjectives, because when you're talking about financial services and you're talking about the markets or the foreign exchange currency, and you're talking about something being bearish or bullish, or whether it's positive or negative, the adjectives used, particularly if you're an analyst or an economist and you're writing it down, they can be, you've got to be careful. Let me say that. When I've written economic reviews and things in the past, and I use an adjective without thinking it through properly, and then you get questioned on it, Yeah. Okay. So he began near the beginning of the interview, obviously talking about the greed. He used the word greed. He talked about American greed, not surprisingly, perhaps. And he did go back to the Cold War. I mean, we had a huge historical build up to this whole interview. I thought we were going to be there forever. And it was, quite a long time, wasn't it? But anyway, let's have a look at my notes here. So Putin talked a little bit about the dollar being the main weapon across the world. So the weaponization of the dollar by the US was something he was particularly keen to express. He said the dollar was a tool of political struggle and that it was a grave mistake to use it in that way. It was a stupid thing to do. He said even the allies were downsizing dollar reserves. So even allies of the US were downsizing their dollar reserves because of their nervousness and anxiety about the strength of, the dollar going forward and the dollar as, a major trading currency. The decision of the US to restrict our use of US dollars, Putin's use of the US dollars, he made a big deal about that being a very silly thing to do. 3% of the transactions were done in the yuan, 34% in rubles. But he said this year we've got, I think, 34% in the yuan. So he was saying, despite what you've done, all you've done is you've driven us to trade more in other currencies, and particularly in the Chinese currency. So not only are we doing much more business with China, and he certainly indicated more business with Europe, you are also forcing us to do massive amounts of business in other currencies by what you've done, which to me, he's got a point, hasn't he? He also used the word self-conceit. That was something he used about the US a lot. Why are they doing this? This is nothing more than the US being self-conceitful or having self-conceit. Gosh, that was funny about the pipeline, wasn't it? I've just got a note here. Germany being the number 2 financial supporter to the Ukraine. That was something he was certainly big in making judgment about. The relationship with Germany was interesting, wasn't it? That's not necessarily economics, but I thought that was interesting when we were talking about the pipeline. And with my heating bills, I would be doing. Right, so he started talking about China. My friend in China. $230 billion, he said, of trade that we are doing, although China said it was $240 billion. We have a well-balanced trade relationship with China. As for BRICS, it's developing very rapidly. In 1992, the BRICS share was 16%, but now it's bigger than the whole of the G7, he proudly said. And then he got onto oil. Oil is traded in yuan, I can't pronounce it, the Chinese currency anyway. Oil exporters say the US is cutting itself off. The US is killing itself. You're killing it, he said. On China, again, he got back to this boogeyman story. And this was in the context, I think, that other media commentators, after he'd explained that there was no point in him explaining the Russian side of the whole pipeline or any other dispute, because the US controlled the whole of the US media and probably most of the European media. So he was saying it's another boogeyman story. It is not true that things are going awry, because actually China are not being aggressive. China are actually looking longer term. They are not threatened and aggressive in the way the US is. They are doing lots of deals themselves. In fact, they're developing their relationships with Europe. They're doing more trade with Europe as a result, again, of pressure. The US pressure. That was something he regularly was talking about. So he said, the Chinese businesses, are exploring more and more in the European market. And then sometimes he actually went straight to Tucker himself and he said, you are killing yourself. And he had a point there. What he was saying is, inevitably, all the actions that the US have taken are forcing Russia and China to trade more in a different currency. You are hurting yourself, he said. You are hurting yourself. You are forcing the growth of business. and the decimation or usage of reduced usage of the dollar. He found the US very difficult to understand in its economic policy. I think he was having a sort of titter, a little bit of a joke to himself, like, what the hell are you guys doing? Do you understand? He said, you print money. You just print money from nowhere. And you're the ones with the 30 trillion debt. Why are you doing it? What is this? What sense is this? I think he was almost like an economics student taking the mickey out of somebody sitting next to him. What the hell are you doing? Why are you just printing money? He talked about excessive production capacities. The US has excessive production capacities, meaning they shouldn't be doing that. They don't know what they're doing. It's excessive. He said, look at Indonesia. Indonesia is developing, within its boundaries, doing well developing. Other places are developing. Why is the US full of self-conceit? Why is it using excessive production capacities? Why is it standing on its laurels pretending it's this great big world economic leader when in fact it's got this huge, great big debt and it's driving the other big G7 competitors against its own economy and to detract from its own currency? They just print money, he said. They just print money. The US will adapt with the help of force. That is all they use, force. Pressure, pressure, force. That's what the US use, he was saying. It's their brutal actions. A lot of this, the wording, brutal, aggression, force, very much how he was describing it. It's counterproductive. The US's economic policy is counterproductive. Yeah, it's not about the US being a leader. He said, I had a very good relationship with Bush. And then he went on to say, because I remember making a note of it, I also had such a personal relationship with Trump, although it's not about the people, he later went on to say. Now, when he got onto his statistics, he quoted numbers. Oof, he got into inflation. He quoted, I think he said, US inflation, it's about 3.4, 3.5, I think. Very much saying, I know what you're doing. He said China is the #1 economy in purchasing power parity, which is very much an economic expression, purchasing power parity. He then said, so China's #1. Then we have India, we have Japan. Russia is 5th, he said. Russia is 5th. But he wasn't very complimentary, let's say. And but he didn't talk about the Biden administration directly, but certainly the way that the US was handling its own home domestic economic policy, let's just say. So I thought that was quite revealing. And I also thought there was a bit of a schoolboy in him, a bit of a competitive edge of, I know my economics, I know the numbers of what's happening in the US economy, I'm watching you, I know what's going on. Anyway, I think that's enough for now. I'm sure you're all exhausted by listening about it. But I think, I know his background is very military and GIU and all the rest of it. And I'm sure he did his homework. But I'd take him on as an economist ahead of Biden by a mile. I mean, Biden would probably forget what day of the week it was, and that wouldn't be good, but anyway, that's Money Penny. Thanks for listening. Catch you soon.